There was no explosion, no warning flare, no gravitational ripple to signal its arrival. At exactly 3:47 in the morning on December 16th, multiple deep space radar arrays went blind for just under 4 seconds. It wasn't a glitch, it wasn't solar interference, it was a shadow, a vast, cold, perfectly structured shadow, so large it erased not just visible light, but the background microwave radiation itself. And when the signal came back, it was still there, motionless, silent, and 40 times the size of 3I Atlas. This wasn't just another rogue comet. This wasn't a rock tumbling through space. It was something built. It reflected no light. It emitted no heat. It disrupted every radio band, but didn't interfere with gravity the way a solid object should. What we saw, or rather what we didn't, broke every model we've used to understand interstellar matter. And yet, it moved with purpose toward us. Over the next 6 hours, it aligned itself on a trajectory that took it straight toward Earth's orbital plane, not randomly, not chaotically, but with precision so sharp it outperformed our own satellites. And then it did something stranger. It stopped accelerating and began to orient, like a machine calibrating itself to a known system, as if Earth were not a destination, but a target. By the time the global scientific community caught up, the object was already within range of Earth's extended magnetosphere. And that's when the anomalies started. Communications blackouts, local magnetic oscillations, even a sudden spike in atmospheric resonance over the South Pacific. Some dismissed it, called it a software glitch, a misread signal. But the timing was too perfect. The sync was too exact. This wasn't random, it was engineered, and now it's here, holding just outside our upper atmosphere, not crashing, not orbiting, positioning. So what is it? A probe? A vessel? A weapon? No one knows. But across 22 chapters, we're going to follow the clues, from the first radar echoes to the electromagnetic fractures, to the moment our atmosphere began to behave like it was being scanned. Because this is not a comet. This is not an asteroid. This is a structure. And it didn't arrive by accident. It didn't appear all at once. It arrived like a silence that deepens, noticeable only when everything else goes quiet. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It didn't come through a spectacular telescope image or a breaking announcement. It began with subtraction, with something that wasn't there. Not a new light, but a missing one. On the morning of December 16th, a routine cross-analysis of sky survey data returned a patch of sky darker than expected. Not dimmer by brightness, darker by behavior. Multiple background stars were measured, but their light was weaker, less defined, slightly muted. These were stars with known magnitudes, regularly used for calibration, and yet their readings had dipped, subtly but undeniably. The signal drop was first dismissed as atmospheric interference. Then it was blamed on partial cloud cover or misaligned lensing from ground-based telescopes. But when space-based sensors confirmed the same anomaly, doubt gave way to precision. This wasn't a glitch. It was a shadow. It moved slowly, not like a meteor or a comet. There was no trail behind it, no sudden movement, just a consistent silence in the data, as though something immense without heat or glow was passing quietly across the background of the galaxy. Astronomers mapped its path not by tracking it directly, but by what it obscured. Stars that should have been visible appeared dimmer. The effect repeated frame by frame, a pattern formed, a blank moving across the canvas of space, a black geometry, invisible except through its effect on light. Unlike comets, it had no halo. Unlike asteroids, it had no flicker or spin. There was no reflectivity to speak of, no infrared echo, nothing to catch the instruments, just absence. And that absence was massive. It wasn't just the shape that disturbed the analysts, it was the consistency of that shape. Every other natural object of this scale, the ones measured in kilometers, shows variation. They deform, they spin unevenly, they shed particles, they scatter light, even poorly. But this silhouette was uniform, smooth, clean, a single presence blocking the light without breaking it. Calculations began immediately. If it was a comet, where was the coma? If it was a rock, why no thermal signal? If it was dust, why no spectral absorption? There were no answers, but the conclusion was growing harder to ignore. This was not an object in the traditional sense. It was structure, defined by symmetry, confirmed by motion. Its velocity wasn't erratic. It didn't tumble. It translated across the sky like a ship on a fixed course. The stars behind it flickered briefly as it passed, then returned. A lane of darkness, slowly moving closer. Multiple observatories began focusing on the region simultaneously. Each confirmed the same readings. No visible light, no thermal echo, no gas trails. But the light behind it, behind the object, was changing. Something was bending, scattering, refracting. Not dramatically, but in a way that suggested mass and scale. If you drew a box around it, the smallest one that could fully enclose the disturbance, you would be measuring something at least 40 times the size of 3i Atlas. Possibly more, but size wasn't the issue. The issue was clarity. This wasn't a guess. It wasn't ambiguous data. It was a measurable signature, not just of absence, but of controlled absence. Something that didn't just happen to be dark, but stayed dark consistently, as if by design. In astrophysics, we use light to reveal the nature of things. Heat tells us about composition. Spectra tell us about chemistry. Rotation tells us about shape. But when an object gives you none of that, when it returns no data at all, you're forced to confront the possibility that it's not trying to be seen, not by accident, but by intention. And in that silence, a deeper question takes shape. What blocks this much light, but emits none of its own? It didn't appear all at once. It arrived like a silence that deepens, noticeable only when everything else goes quiet. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It didn't come through a spectacular telescope image or a breaking announcement. It began with subtraction, with something that wasn't there, not a new light, but a missing one. On the morning of December 16th, a routine cross-analysis of sky survey data returned a patch of sky darker than expected. Not dimmer by brightness, darker by behaviour. Multiple background stars were measured, but their light was weaker, less defined, slightly muted. These were stars with known magnitudes, regularly used for calibration, and yet their readings had dipped, subtly but undeniably. The signal drop was first dismissed as atmospheric interference, then it was blamed on partial cloud cover or misaligned lensing from ground-based telescopes. But when space-based sensors confirmed the same anomaly, doubt gave way to precision. This wasn't a glitch, it was a shadow. It moved slowly, not like a meteor or a comet. There was no trail behind it, no sudden movement, just a consistent silence in the data, as though something immense without heat or glow was passing quietly across the background of the galaxy. Astronomers mapped its path not by tracking it directly, but by what it obscured. Stars that should have been visible appeared dimmer. The effect repeated frame by frame, a pattern formed, a blank moving across the canvas of space, a black geometry, invisible except through its effect on light. Unlike comets, it had no halo. Unlike asteroids, it had no flicker or spin. There was no reflectivity to speak of, no infrared echo, nothing to catch the instruments. Just absence. And that absence was massive. It wasn't just the shape that disturbed the analysts, it was the consistency of that shape. Every other natural object of this scale, the ones measured in kilometers, shows variation. They deform, they spin unevenly, they shed particles, they scatter light, even poorly. But this silhouette was uniform, smooth, clean. A single presence blocking the light without breaking it. Calculations began immediately. If it was a comet, where was the coma? If it was a rock, why no thermal signal? If it was dust, why no spectral absorption? There were no answers, but the conclusion was growing harder to ignore. This was not an object in the traditional sense. It was structure, defined by symmetry, confirmed by motion. Its velocity wasn't erratic. It didn't tumble. It translated across the sky like a ship on a fixed course. The stars behind it flickered briefly as it passed, then returned. A lane of darkness, slowly moving closer. Multiple observatories began focusing on the region simultaneously. Each confirmed the same readings. No visible light, no thermal echo, no gas trails. But the light behind it, behind the object, was changing. Something was bending, scattering, refracting. Not dramatically, but in a way that suggested mass and scale. If you drew a box around it, the smallest one that could fully enclose the disturbance, you would be measuring something at least 40 times the size of 3i Atlas. Possibly more. But size wasn't the issue. The issue was clarity. This wasn't a guess. It wasn't ambiguous data. It was a measurable signature. Not just of absence, but of controlled absence. Something that didn't just happen to be dark, but stayed dark, consistently, as if by design. In astrophysics, we use light to reveal the nature of things. Heat tells us about composition. Spectra tell us about chemistry. Rotation tells us about shape. But when an object gives you none of that, when it returns no data at all, you're forced to confront the possibility that it's not trying to be seen. Not by accident, but by intention. And in that silence, a deeper question takes shape. What blocks this much light, but emits none of its own? Rotation is a fundamental signature of natural motion. Everything in space spins. Comets tumble. Asteroids roll. Even irregular ice fragments wobble unevenly as they journey through gravitational fields. That spin, whether chaotic or axial, is what reveals an object's mass distribution, and it's almost impossible to avoid unless deliberate balance is involved. But when this object appeared, it didn't spin at all. Not once in any of the light curve data, not once across multiple imaging sessions, not even when expected by models simulating torque from solar wind or gravitational drift. It moved cleanly across the sky. No shifting brightness, no fluttering of reflected light, no rhythmic dimming. That's how we measure tumbling in distant objects. Small changes in reflectivity over time, as uneven shapes catch and release light. But with this structure, no such signature appeared. It wasn't even slow rotation. It was stillness. That stillness at first was interpreted as a limitation of the data. Perhaps the object was rotating slowly, once every several hours or even days, at a pace too subtle to register. But when different observatories across the globe attempted to confirm that possibility with higher precision instruments, the result was the same, no measurable spin. And that's when questions deepened. Because without rotation, and without stabilization, most objects of this size become unstable. Gravity tugs on uneven mass. Internal pressures shift. Micrometeoroid impacts, solar wind. These small inputs accumulate, and over time the object begins to rotate, even minutely. Yet this one refused to. It maintained a stable orientation across all frames of reference. That stability was observed not just in optical data, but in radar and infrared timing. Signals bounced back from its surface came with no Doppler variation. That implies not just lack of rotation, but controlled absence of it. Natural celestial bodies have moments of inertia that define how they rotate. Even if formed in perfect conditions, they develop spin-through interactions, especially when passing near stars. Comets, in particular, develop asymmetric outgassing, where sunlight heats one side more than another, and jets of gas push them into uneven spin. 3i Atlas spun. It danced. It shifted its orientation as its core outgassed. But this object, 40 times larger, drifted with poise, as though its centre of mass was balanced in all directions. That kind of motion is not natural. That is programmed equilibrium. And still, nothing in its path altered that motion. It passed through gradients in solar wind, minor gravitational fields and radiation belts, but emerged with no deviation, no roll, no yaw. To maintain a fixed posture in space requires two things, either extreme symmetry by chance or stabilization by design. Natural symmetry breaks apart at large scale. Rock is never uniform. Dust distributes unevenly. Ice melts asymmetrically. But artificial symmetry, that remains. It's repeatable. It's precise. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the object's motion relative to the solar system barycenter, the gravitational center of all planetary bodies, remained tightly consistent. That meant no external force was affecting its orientation. It was either inherently resistant to those forces or actively correcting for them, but with no visible thrusters, no outgassing jets, no vapor trails. What was keeping it aligned? Could it be magnetic stabilization, gravitational correction, or something we haven't encountered? If an object is designed to move through space without revealing itself, no glow, no spin, no heat, then the best camouflage is to move as little as possible. And this structure obeyed that principle. It moved with minimal disturbance, no flicker, no trace, just quiet, forward translation, not tumbling, not resisting, just existing in equilibrium, like it had been waiting in deep space for the right moment to begin moving again. And when it did, it moved not like a rock, not like a comet, but like a craft. Light defines space. It's how we know anything is there at all. Even the faintest glimmer of scattered photons tells us something about an object's shape, its surface, its motion, or its composition. Space is a dance of reflections, absorptions, and emissions. But this object, this black structure, reflected nothing. It didn't shimmer. It didn't glow. It didn't flash under starlight. It simply erased light. Cleanly, quietly. And that's what made it more than unusual. When instruments designed to detect near-infrared wavelengths were trained on the object, the results returned flat. No albedo curve. No thermal bloom. No variation across its surface. Even highly porous carbonaceous chondrites, some of the darkest natural materials in the known solar system, reflect a small percentage of light, enough to register a whisper of what they are. But this object didn't whisper. It swallowed light entirely. Across multiple spectrums, from ultraviolet to near-infrared, it produced the same signature. Nothing. That's not silence from distance or scale. That's intentional darkness. The most unsettling part wasn't just the blackness itself. It was the consistency. Whether observed at glancing angles or full exposure, the readings didn't change. A comet, for example, will show brightening as it turns. Its irregular shape reveals hotspots and cold regions as it rotates. Even asteroids flicker as they roll, but this did not. Its signal remained utterly flat. Its darkness was engineered. Surface analysis using photometric backscatter techniques confirmed what the visual data suggested. The surface did not behave like stone. It lacked the microstructure typical of dust-covered objects. No granular scattering, no frost reflectivity, no polarized response to solar photons. Instead, it absorbed, perfectly, like a light trap. This anomaly prompted immediate comparisons to Earth's darkest synthetic materials, things like vantablack, a laboratory-grown carbon nanotube forest designed to absorb more than 99.9% of visible light. That material, under the right conditions, can make three-dimensional objects appear flat to the human eye. Surfaces vanish, shapes become silhouettes, and this object in space acted similarly, not in theory, in real, observable data. But unlike vantablack, which is fragile and unstable outside controlled environments, this structure held its properties through space radiation, cosmic rays, and solar wind, none of which degraded its absorbance, which begged the question, what kind of surface resists all forms of reflectivity, yet shows no sign of breakdown? The implications were heavy. Either this object is made of a naturally occurring material we've never discovered, one with properties of light absorption that exceed every known asteroid, moon, or interstellar rock, or it is covered in something engineered to hide it from view. And that's where the idea of intention returned. Because darkness, in itself, isn't rare. Plenty of asteroids are dark. Plenty of icy bodies absorb more than they reflect. But uniform, pitch-black material across a structure this large, that does not form by chance. There was no banding, no patchwork, no regions of discoloration. It was seamless, as though coated, as though wrapped in the cosmic equivalent of stealth paint. This surface didn't just fail to reflect, it nullified detection. Infrared scanners couldn't pick up surface temperature. Passive radar couldn't resolve texture. Even polarization-sensitive instruments failed to identify any specular components. Every signal was flattened, and in that silence a pattern emerged. Because every natural body reveals something about itself under pressure. It flakes, it sublimates, it glows when struck by charged particles. But this object remained silent under every lens. It's not that it didn't want to be seen, it's that it was made not to be. In space, heat leaves fingerprints. Even the coldest objects absorb some solar radiation. And that energy, once captured, must go somewhere. It either gets re-radiated as infrared, re-emitted through sublimation, or stored internally, temporarily, until thermal equilibrium forces it outward. But this object doesn't follow that logic. It absorbs radiation, and then it disappears. When the black structure was first identified, astronomers assumed it was simply cold enough that its thermal emissions would fall below the sensitivity threshold of ground-based infrared telescopes. That would be plausible, if not for one crucial fact. It was moving toward the Sun. By the time it was officially confirmed, the structure had already crossed into a region of space where solar flux reaches levels high enough to heat even distant gas giants. Comets at similar distances vaporize. Metal surfaces on spacecraft begin radiating energy at measurable rates. Every rock, dust fragment, and icy object in that region reacts predictably to the Sun's growing intensity. But not this. No increase in brightness, no heat plume, no emission line across any known spectrum. In fact, as it moved closer, its thermal profile remained flat. And that's when planetary physicists realized they weren't looking at a cold object. They were looking at one that refused to warm up. Passive bodies don't do this. Even dark asteroids eventually re-radiate energy after prolonged solar exposure. Their surfaces warm, their thermal inertia rises, and as they spin, we observe temperature gradients. Hot on the sunlit side, cold on the shadowed side. It's a dance of light and material, a conversation between radiation and mass. But this object was silent on both sides. No heat signature followed its sun-facing side. No temperature lag echoed from its shadow. It didn't glow. It didn't fluctuate. It remained, impossibly, thermally invisible. To verify this, researchers turned to space-based infrared telescopes, far more sensitive than anything on Earth. The results were the same. Across multiple wavelengths, from shortwave to far infrared, there was no registered emission above the background of space itself. This object absorbed energy, but didn't re-emit it. Not as heat, not as light, not as anything we could detect. The question became, where is the energy going? Some suggested internal storage, that the structure was somehow holding heat beneath its surface. But that theory comes with its own problems. Even the most insulated materials eventually radiate. The laws of thermodynamics demand it, unless the energy is being redirected, rather than stored. That's when a new possibility emerged, that the surface wasn't just black in colour, but black in function, metamaterial level black. A surface engineered not just to absorb, but to convert. There are laboratory materials on Earth, primitive ones, that convert electromagnetic radiation into electrical current at near-perfect efficiency. They're small, unstable, and require extreme conditions to operate. But the physics is sound, and the effect, if scaled, would look exactly like what this structure was doing, absorbing solar radiation and emitting nothing. If that's true, the object may not be storing heat at all. It may be transforming it into kinetic energy, into directed momentum, into a system we don't yet understand. The absence of heat isn't a passive condition. It's an active choice, an effect of an unknown mechanism that reroutes energy from the visible and thermal spectrum into something else entirely. This would explain why the object remains cool despite exposure. It would explain why it hasn't cracked or splintered under solar stress. It would explain why no thermal signature follows it, even as the sun grows larger in its path. It isn't cooling itself. It isn't radiating. It's doing something more advanced, something deliberate. The object isn't just black. It's functionally invisible to heat. And that is not a feature of nature. It's a feature of design. Trajectory is the language of prediction. Once an object is spotted, its path becomes mathematics. Mass, velocity, angle, gravitational fields. These ingredients combine to form a projection. And most of the time, celestial bodies obey that projection with only slight deviations. Comets may shift slightly from outgassing. Asteroids may wobble from solar radiation pressure. But the math, in general, holds. With this object, the math held, too perfectly. When it was first mapped, its path seemed standard. A slow inbound arc from the outer regions, shallow approach, no tight bends or plunges. But over the days that followed, astronomers began to notice something they hadn't seen before, not in any interstellar object, and certainly not in anything this large. There was no drift, no hesitation, no rotational torque, no gravitational wobble. Its path didn't flex when it passed through microfields. It didn't respond to radiation pressure. It didn't react to solar wind. Every model, from the basic two-body simulation to the full solar system barycenter map, returned the same result. The object was following a line more precise than nature typically allows. This wasn't randomness. It was refinement. Naturally formed objects, especially large ones, carry internal asymmetries. Tiny flaws in mass distribution, slight differences in surface composition. These are enough to cause perturbations when the object interacts with sunlight, planetary tides, or even magnetic fields. But this one? It passed through gravitational gradients with no reaction. It crossed into varying solar radiation zones with no response. There was no pushback, no acceleration, no angle correction. Its inertia appeared constant, too constant. At first, teams assumed it must be heavy, so massive that minor forces couldn't move it. But gravitational lensing analysis, based on background star bending, showed otherwise. Its mass wasn't infinite. It was large, yes, but not beyond measure. It should have shown at least minor gravitational susceptibility. Instead, it behaved like it was isolated from those forces entirely. More data followed. The Deep Space Network in Australia triangulated position against planetary drift. Observatories in Chile and Hawaii provided parallax data for real-time motion curves. Nothing changed. Every data point fell perfectly on the projected arc. That's not normal, not at this scale. And that's where another question surfaced, one far more unsettling. If it's not being corrected by nature, is it correcting itself? Because maintaining that level of trajectory consistency requires either extraordinary luck or deliberate calibration. But there was no evidence of propulsion, no visible jets, no ion trail, no recoil motion. It just stayed on course. That kind of motion hints at one thing: control. In spaceflight engineering, precision trajectories are achieved with constant micro-adjustments, thrusters firing in brief pulses to counteract radiation drift or gravitational anomalies. On Earth, we've done this with probes like Voyager, Cassini, and the James Webb Space Telescope, but those craft require engines, fuel, and frequent course corrections, and when they drift, we see it in their path. This object showed none of that. No burns, no recorrections. Yet it maintained its track to within fractions of a percent, hour after hour, day after day. Which means it's either shielded from external forces by something we don't understand, or it's actively managing its own path in a way we can't yet detect. Because even the smallest deviation should have appeared by now. Even one close pass near a gravitational pocket should have bent its course. But nothing has. Its motion is not only steady, it's suspiciously clean. And now analysts across agencies are whispering the same sentence, buried deep in internal reports. This is not ballistic motion. Because ballistic motion, natural, unpowered motion, always carries a trace of error, and this object's path contains none. It's not just moving, it's navigating. To understand what this black structure is, we need to contrast it with what we've already seen, what we thought was strange before today. That brings us to 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object ever recorded, the one that stirred global attention just weeks ago, the one that challenged conventional comet physics. It outgassed unexpectedly. It defied fragmentation models. It even appeared to absorb and redirect solar energy in ways that made experts hesitate. But next to this, next to the structure we're now tracking, 3I Atlas looks wild, emotional, chaotic, and that difference matters. 3I Atlas, for all its strangeness, behaved like a body under stress. It flared during perihelion, it vented gases along complex jets, it developed a tail, and even, inexplicably, an anti-tail that pointed toward the sun. There were spikes in brightness, deviations in its trajectory, shifts in spectral signature. It was active, it was noisy, it reacted to the sun like something that wasn't sure if it would survive. And we measured that behavior in real time. Photometric data captured flickers of heat, spectrographs tracked outgassed molecules, telescopes recorded its ion tail lengthening then fading. It was alive with thermodynamic struggle. This new object, it has none of that. No tail, no outgassing, no brightness variation, no acceleration event. Where 3I Atlas shouted, this structure whispers. Where Atlas revealed its chemistry, Carbon dioxide dominating, ice sublimating, this black form reveals nothing. There is no emission line, no signal in hydroxyl bands, no thermal bloom, no dust trail. Its silence is not just quieter, it's total. 3I Atlas moved erratically compared to this. Its path shifted slightly as it interacted with solar pressure. It responded to flares, once even emitting a momentary burst of reflectivity during a coronal mass ejection. Its spin pattern suggested internal imbalance, possibly caused by asymmetrical melting or gas jets beneath the surface. But the black structure doesn't spin, doesn't pulse, doesn't vary. It moves with a kind of patience we don't associate with natural objects, a glide that ignores solar influence. And then there's fragmentation. This was the fear with Atlas, that it would fracture like so many other comets have before, that it would fall apart during its closest approach. The tension was real because that's what solar heating does to fragile interstellar bodies, but while Atlas survived, it did so loudly. It vented aggressively, forming visible stress lines in its trailing dust envelope. The jets showed orientation shifts. There was vibration in its coma structure, minor but trackable. This black object has none of that pressure signature. It doesn't appear to be fighting its environment. It isn't flexing under sunlight. It's not holding together under stress. It simply remains. And that's the core difference. Atlas looked alive. This looks engineered. Not alive biologically, but alive with natural physics, with chemistry and volatility, with ice becoming gas, with pressure building and releasing. That's what made 3I Atlas fascinating. It lived at the edge of what we understand. This structure doesn't live at the edge. It exists outside the spectrum entirely. The only similarity, trajectory. Both came from outside our solar system. Both entered on hyperbolic paths. But the comparison ends there, because Atlas told us a story through its mass loss, its tail structure, its temperature curve. This object tells us nothing, and maybe that's the most important message, because when nature behaves strangely, we learn. But when something chooses not to speak at all, that's no longer behavior, that's silence with intent. Thursius's Atlas challenged the models. This object challenges the premise, and for scientists who believed Atlas was as strange as space could get, this is something else entirely. Silence in space is rarely silent. Every object, whether asteroid, comet, or fragment of dust, emits something. Not sound, of course, but data, reflected light, thermal radiation, charged particle interaction, movement that can be measured and modelled. But this black structure defies that expectation, and that's a problem. From the moment it was identified, on the morning of December 17th, radio telescopes were aimed directly at it. Not to hear voices, not to detect signals in the science fiction sense, but to listen for natural emissions. Every body in space hums, rattles, or at the very least echoes. When solar wind hits rock, it resonates faintly. When UV radiation strikes a dust shell, it fluoresces, even if briefly. Even thermal bodies in deep freeze release residual radiation in the infrared band. But here, there's nothing. No echo, no hum, no re-emission spike, and that silence is measurable. 3 observatories confirmed it by nightfall. Spectral scans showed no thermal delta. That is, the object didn't warm up when the sun hit it. Not even slightly. It absorbed radiation without responding, as if it was made of something that didn't behave like rock or metal or ice. That raises a dangerous question. How can something be that cold, that black, and still reflect enough light for us to track it optically? We can see it. We know it's there. Its silhouette cuts across background stars like a moving void, yet it gives off no heat. That breaks the basic rules of observational astronomy. And still, that isn't the most disturbing silence. Deep space antennas listening on neutral hydrogen bands, X-ray emissions, and even narrowband UV caught nothing. No chirp, no pulse, no echo from Earth-based radar pings. Even when a burst of radio waves was sent deliberately toward the object, a standard planetary radar technique, there was no return. It swallowed the beam. To be clear, even the moon bounces back radar. Even icy moons beyond Jupiter give us a whisper of return. But this doesn't whisper. It doesn't even reject. It just remains quiet. So scientists began asking, is this silence a symptom or a strategy? Because passive silence can be natural. A carbon-rich body, for example, might absorb most frequencies. A dense asteroid with a regolith layer of fine particles could mute thermal spikes. But total silence, across every band, that's not a symptom, that's suppression. It suggests active dampening, as if, whatever this object is, it's deliberately quiet, and that presents a new kind of threat. Because in space, detection is everything. We plan missions based on heat signatures. We adjust satellite positions based on orbital noise. We map foreign bodies by interpreting the signals they release or deflect. Silence removes that framework. It means we can't predict acceleration. We can't model spin. We can't even guess at composition. We are essentially blind. And that's the problem. It's not just that this object is bigger than 3i Atlas, it's that it's quieter, colder, slower, and possibly smarter. Every natural process we know creates noise. This doesn't. That means one of two things. Either we've found a new class of matter, something that doesn't behave like anything in our current catalogues, or this isn't a natural object at all. And if it isn't natural, then it's quiet for a reason. Because silence in deep space isn't emptiness, it's design. And the closer this black structure comes to Earth, the more urgent that silence becomes. We aren't just watching it anymore, we're listening. And still, it says nothing. If the black structure wouldn't speak, scientists turn to the oldest language in astronomy, shadows. Even when an object refuses to emit, reflect, or echo, it cannot escape light entirely. When it moves across a known background, stars, cosmic microwave radiation, solar flare fields, it leaves a scar, a brief gap in the otherwise stable glow of the cosmos. That gap can be measured. And on the morning of December 17th, that's exactly what astronomers did. At first, they expected a diffuse shadow. That's what comets usually leave behind. Their cores are too small to block much, but their tails and halos distort the light behind them in a fog-like manner. Asteroids, depending on rotation, may create jagged, inconsistent profiles, but this one was clean. When it moved in front of a dense star field near the direction of Cygnus, something startling appeared. The stars blinked out, one by one, not dimmed, but cut, as if behind a curtain. The edges of the shadow weren't fuzzy, they were sharp, too sharp. It wasn't like watching a rock pass through space, it was like watching an eclipse made by geometry. The first full silhouette measurement came from an optical array in Chile. Over a 10-second window, the object blocked out 17 distinguishable stars, each one separated across an angular band wide enough to suggest a span larger than anyone expected. That was when the real shock began. Based on timing and cross-checked with known star positions, the width of the shadow cast by this structure was approximately 40 times that of 3i Atlas. Not in mass, not in length, just in effective silhouette. That put it into the range of city-scale structures, multiple kilometers across. And yet, no tail, no dust, no fragmentation trail. But there was something even stranger. The shape wasn't spherical. It wasn't oblong like a comet or potato-shaped like a tumbling asteroid. The outline was, unnervingly, regular. The Chilean team hesitated before releasing the data. Then, as more observatories confirmed the same thing, the pattern held. The edges formed straight angles, not perfect 90 degrees, but linear enough to rule out natural fracture. No known celestial body creates planar surfaces like this. These weren't erosion lines, they were contours, deliberate ones. And then came the rotation frames. Over 3 successive nights, the shadow passed in front of different star clusters. By calculating angle, angular velocity, and occlusion time, scientists deduced the object's spin, or rather, its lack of spin. It wasn't tumbling, it wasn't rolling or pitching, it was gliding, fixed, like it was maintaining orientation, almost like it was stabilizing itself. That's not what space rocks do. At this point, panic didn't set in, but something else did. Doubt. Because every physical law we rely on expects variability, randomness, rotational chaos, frictionless drift. Instead, this shadow behaved like it was under control. And if that's the case, then what we're observing might not be an asteroid at all. It might be a vehicle, or worse, something not built to move, but to watch. Because every satellite we've ever launched casts a perfect shadow. Geometry is a sign of design. And for the first time, Humanity was staring at a shadow in space that felt like it didn't belong to nature. It belonged to intention. The silence we couldn't break now had a shape, and that shape was watching back. What came next wasn't a revelation, it was a confirmation, and sometimes that's worse. When the first clear shadow measurements hinted at geometric design, skepticism naturally followed. Maybe it was a trick of perspective. Maybe it was an observational artifact, a misalignment, a lucky coincidence of overlapping debris fields. But the next round of data stripped away those doubts. Multiple optical telescopes, including those in Mauna Kea, the Canary Islands, and a private orbital system recently launched for Earth defense mapping, all confirmed one feature in common. The surface of the object absorbed nearly all incoming light across the visual and infrared spectrum. It was, for lack of a better word, matte. No shine, no glint, no solar reflection, not even the slight glimmer expected from dust grains. The implications of that were unsettling. In space, almost everything reflects something. Even comets coated in dark carbon compounds scatter enough light to produce measurable albedo values. But here, we were looking at a structure, immense in size, that absorbed nearly everything. Not just in one spectrum, but across several. Even radar mapping produced barely any return. It behaved like a black hole, without the gravity. That wasn't just strange, it was intentional. Surface mapping through infrared scatter, normally used to detect heat variation in meteors, returned a flat reading. No hot spots, no cold spots, no rotational thermal gradient. Either this structure was being artificially cooled, or its surface was engineered to deflect detection entirely. That's not a feature of naturally formed objects. That's a feature of stealth systems. In military terms, this would be called non-reflective armor. On Earth, it's used to hide submarines and aircraft from radar and visual targeting systems. In space? No known probe, rock, or relic has ever demonstrated it on this scale, but that wasn't the end of it. One of the most crucial observations came from a reflected light experiment performed at the Lagrange Point Solar Monitor designed to catch early flare activity. As the object crossed a radial line between the Sun and the Earth, sensors expected at least some bounce back, an echo of photons, even scattered. Nothing came. The signature was void. That absence wasn't just data, it was design. And that led to one of the most controversial questions yet. Was this thing built to be invisible? If so, then we hadn't stumbled across a rogue object hurtling through space. We'd detected something that wasn't meant to be seen, something that might have been out there for a long time, watching, observing, maybe even parked just beyond detection limits, until something changed, until its vector started shifting, until it came closer. That change in motion, combined with the structure's unusual surface, suggested a motive, or at least a pattern of behavior. Because when something this large and this silent begins to align its movement toward Earth while remaining visually cloaked, it's no longer considered random. It becomes strategic, and that changed the entire framework of the investigation. Suddenly, astronomers weren't comparing it to comets or asteroids anymore. They began comparing it to known stealth satellites, to low-orbit recon devices, and in some cases to classified experimental tech. Only one problem. Even the most advanced Earth-made systems aren't this perfect. What was detected didn't just lack reflection, it lacked intention to be found. And in that quiet void, something even more chilling emerged. The idea that it may have succeeded. Because if not for 3i Atlas, if not for the distraction of that other interstellar anomaly, we might never have looked this way, never traced this silhouette, never noticed the absence where light should be. This wasn't just a shell, it was a statement, one written in shadow, outlined in silence, and now drifting directly into view. Trajectory was supposed to be the easy part. When you track an object in space, the most fundamental calculation is its orbit, or lack thereof. Gravity is predictable, mass affects acceleration in ways we've understood since Newton. But with this black structure, those rules didn't seem to apply in any conventional way. From the very beginning, its path toward Earth defied more than just expectation, it undermined confidence in the underlying models themselves. The anomaly wasn't immediately obvious. In fact, early projections from observatories in Chile and Arizona placed the object on a slow inbound arc, almost grazing the same region of solar influence as 3i Atlas. Initially, it was considered a coincidence, a proximity event. At worst, two unrelated bodies briefly entering the same neighbourhood. But within 48 hours of those predictions, something shifted. Not the object itself, but the model. Every hour as new data flowed in, the computed trajectory adjusted again, then again, and again. Each recalibration curved the path slightly more inward, closer, more aligned with Earth's orbital lane. The more accurate the readings became, the more wrong the original projections looked. Eventually, it became undeniable. The object wasn't just moving toward Earth, it was correcting its flight path as it approached. And that was not something space debris does. In orbital mechanics, even minor course changes require force. Whether it's a burst of propellant, a gravitational assist, or a reactive push from solar radiation, something has to cause the shift. Here there was no obvious external influence, no visible thrusters, no coma of gases like we see with comets. And still, the object's path was tightening. Not chaotic, not tumbling, controlled. The anomaly wasn't just in the direction, but the precision. Every hour the object shaved off deviations, no drift, no wobble, no unpredictable tugs from solar wind or planetary interference. Just a clean, unwavering course toward Earth's orbital window. This raised a second question. If it was adjusting its own path, what was guiding it? That's when astronomers began to notice a second pattern, one hidden in the timestamps of the data. Every minor trajectory correction occurred in synchronization with Earth's rotational alignment. Not the planet's position around the Sun, but the Earth's axial rotation. Like a probe waiting for the right face of Earth to turn toward it. Or a signal lock that required line of sight through the atmosphere. This wasn't just inbound, it was aware. Still, nothing confirmed intentional navigation until the third anomaly appeared. During what should have been a passive transit past Jupiter's gravitational field, the object did something no natural body ever has. It resisted slingshot acceleration. Normally, any object passing that close to Jupiter's mass would gain velocity, sometimes exponentially. But not here. Instead of gaining speed, it decelerated, gradually, deliberately, as though it recognized the gravity well, but didn't want to ride it. It chose to slow down. That realization shifted everything. What we thought was a random inbound object became something more, a craft, or at the very least, a structure operating with internal guidance, possibly even intelligence. The flight path, anomaly, as it came to be known in internal NASA discussions, was no longer about math. It was about intent. No known natural body behaves like this, and certainly nothing this large, this stealthy, and this directional. It didn't fall toward us. It steered. And once that became clear, silence fell over nearly every institutional channel. Briefings were cut short. Panels were postponed. Updates became scarce. But that silence only amplified what was already written in the stars, because this object wasn't just passing through, it was arriving. If the flight path suggested intent, the sound sealed it. Technically, space is silent. It has no air to carry traditional sound waves, but it does carry something else: electromagnetic vibrations, low-frequency pulses, plasma wave activity. These vibrations are often captured by space probes and translated into sound for analysis. What seems silent to the human ear becomes something you can hear when the data is processed. And this time, the sound was different. It started with Voyager, not the original craft, but its legacy systems, still relaying background frequencies from the heliosphere's edge. Embedded within the usual cosmic static was a subtle, repeating rhythm. At first it resembled the low-pitched tremor of magnetic interactions. Then it got louder, clearer, more structured, almost melodic. The same tone began surfacing in unrelated channels, picked up by solar observatories, by magnetosphere monitors, even deep-sea microphones designed to detect shifts in Earth's crust. A pulse, deep and deliberate, throbbed below audible range, and it matched almost perfectly the trajectory of the black structure. But this wasn't just a background hum, it was directional. Each observatory that logged it noted a strange phenomenon. The resonance was strongest not from the object's projected path, but from the direction Earth would be in 12 hours later. As if the signal wasn't chasing where we were, but where we would be. The shape of the resonance wasn't natural. Most cosmic vibrations fluctuate. They have a noise profile that follows turbulence, like storms or solar winds. But this one was steady, laser-thin, and recurring at intervals that mirrored human time cycles, every 6 hours, then every 12, then aligned with the 24-hour rotation of Earth. What was stranger was its reaction to being observed. As soon as the low-frequency resonance was triangulated, it changed. Instruments that previously recorded it at 0.3 Hz suddenly went silent. Then the signal reappeared, but only on isolated channels, as if it was deliberately hopping frequencies, like something aware it had been detected. This spooked the deep space network. In classified communication channels, project leaders noted a pattern that could not be dismissed. The pulse was adapting, moving, learning. And then came the resonance spike. Just past midnight on December 16th, a sudden amplification of the signal was recorded simultaneously in South Africa, Australia, and Greenland, locations on opposite hemispheres. The pulse went from subtle vibration to full waveform, audible even without translation. It didn't sound like static, it didn't sound like thunder, it sounded like breath, heavy, slow, and repeated. Engineers ran the data through every known noise filter, expecting a glitch or perhaps seismic interference, but the waveform was clean, perfect, designed. It was no longer a vibration, it was a message, no language, no encryption, just pure resonance. A frequency that moved not through space but through material, through ice sheets, through mountain ranges, through fiber optic cables. Every corner of Earth's infrastructure trembled for 11 seconds, and then silence. All across the network, telemetry showed that monitoring satellites reset. Clocks recalibrated, GPS drifts surged then corrected. It was as if Earth systems had been temporarily disrupted, like someone reaching out and tapping the entire planet just once to see what would respond. And that silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It felt like anticipation. The low-frequency resonance hasn't returned since, not in the same form, not with the same reach. But the after-effects linger. Fault lines that weren't there before. Electrical irregularities. A minor but measurable global clock drift that no one can explain. As if the signal didn't just echo through the Earth. It changed it. And now, with the structure closing in, the question grows louder than the pulse itself. Was it calling out, or calling home? When the signal stopped, satellites across multiple orbits began registering something new, not a flash, not an object, a zone. It came from the same direction the black structure had been approaching, but it wasn't the structure itself, it was something surrounding it. A spatial distortion large enough to register across 3 different bands of satellite optics. Not heat, not light, not mass, a shadow. And it wasn't blocking sunlight, it was warping it. Telescopes in Chile were the first to notice it. A wide halo, darker than the void itself, began forming around the object's projected approach. At first they assumed it was the tail of debris, maybe residual ejecta forming a loose field. But spectral analysis ruled that out. There was no dust, no ice, no particulate material of any kind. The halo wasn't reflecting light, it was swallowing it. When filtered through narrow-band photometry, the outline became clear, a perfect ring, expanding outward in symmetry with the object's inward path. It had no colour signature, no electromagnetic glow. And most disturbing of all, it didn't scatter starlight. Behind it, the stars disappeared. The zone wasn't just dim, it was empty. To observers, it behaved less like a cloud and more like a portal. Anything within its radius didn't return light. It absorbed it like a gravitational lens, but without any of the expected gravitational distortion. Even black holes, as intense as they are, still bend light in predictable arcs. But this wasn't a bend. This was an erasure. Scientists from the European Space Agency gave it a temporary name, the Shadow Ring. That name didn't stay internal for long. Amateur astronomers across Europe began to notice the same effect, a growing, silent gap in the sky. And as the object moved closer to Earth, so did the ring. But its centre never aligned perfectly with the structure. It hovered offset, like an eclipse that wasn't cast by the object itself. One theory began gaining traction. This wasn't a ring caused by the structure. It was a signature of interaction. A field of distortion responding to Earth's proximity, as though whatever the object was, it wasn't entering Earth's space. Earth was entering its. The eerie part came with infrared imaging. When viewed in thermal contrast, the ring wasn't just dark, it was cold. Much colder than space, nearly absolute zero. That shouldn't be possible. Even in deep space, cosmic background radiation maintains a baseline warmth. But this zone showed none. It was colder than space itself. That triggered alarm. If something could suppress background radiation, it meant more than just shielding. It meant active cancellation. Like noise-cancelling headphones, but on a planetary scale. Whatever created the ring wasn't reflecting light. It was nullifying it, deleting energy from the space around it. And that begged a darker question. What happens when that ring touches Earth? No one had answers. Projections showed that the leading edge of the ring, if it continued expanding at the same pace, would make contact with Earth's upper atmosphere within 2 days. That would place it directly over the Pacific. But the structure wasn't projected to arrive until hours later, which meant the ring would arrive first. Engineers scrambled to understand the implications. Could satellites fail? Would light-based communications collapse? Would sunlight vanish temporarily from part of the sky? Or worse, would we simply not see what came next? Several nations issued private advisories to observatories. Nighttime observation windows were narrowed. High-altitude flights were cancelled quietly. And as the ring's leading edge passed beyond lunar orbit, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a shadow, it was a boundary, and Earth was about to cross it. As the shadow ring advanced, a second anomaly emerged, and this one didn't just absorb light. It altered force. Satellite clusters in medium Earth orbit began reporting minor trajectory deviations. Nothing chaotic, no collisions, but slight drifts. Predictable flight paths showed unexpected curvature, barely measurable at first, then stronger. It was subtle, less than a meter's shift over dozens of kilometers. But the real concern wasn't the movement, it was the absence of an explanation. There were no gravitational anomalies reported from the Moon, no solar flares, no geomagnetic storm. Yet satellite guidance systems began compensating for a pull that didn't exist on any map. A pull that didn't match Newtonian physics, or any known mass. When multiple low-orbit satellites began echoing similar data, the International Space Union designated a temporary zone, GNZ-1, the first officially recognized gravity null zone ever recorded near Earth. This wasn't the same as microgravity, or the Lagrange points where gravitational forces cancel each other out. This was different. Objects inside the zone weren't experiencing equilibrium, they were experiencing absence. Astronaut telemetry from the ISS confirmed it in real time. An onboard wrench, secured with standard magnetic latches, briefly lifted during a routine equipment check, then floated slowly toward the outer hull. Instruments aboard the station confirmed that for exactly 3 minutes, the internal artificial gravity created by station spin was reduced by nearly 1%. The reason? The station had momentarily passed through the edge of GNZ-1, and that changed everything. Ground-based simulations quickly modelled the anomaly and revealed a chilling detail. The gravity null zone was not static. It was growing, slowly but steadily. It wasn't moving in a perfect sphere around the structure either. It seemed to follow the same off-centered pattern as the shadow ring. But instead of light, it was absorbing the effect of mass. Gravitational fields from nearby celestial bodies showed low-frequency oscillation, barely enough to measure, but consistent enough to confirm one terrifying thing. This zone didn't obey local gravity. It created its own, and worse, it cancelled the rest. The implications were enormous. If this field reached Earth's surface, it could disrupt everything from satellite navigation to internal planetary balance. Tides, mantle flow, even tectonic stress could be affected. Earth's crust depends on consistent gravitational feedback loops to remain in a state of dynamic equilibrium. If even a portion of those loops failed, the effects could range from minor tremors to global-scale quakes. Not because gravity increased, but because it blinked out and came back. And if this zone could suppress gravitational influence, it might also suppress the delicate force chains within atoms themselves. That meant one unspoken possibility: temporary matter destabilization. Earth's core generates its magnetic field in part from convective motion driven by gravity. If that motion halts, even for moments, the field could pulse, oscillate, fail. This wasn't just a hypothetical. One research station in the South Pacific, stationed near the equator to monitor fluctuations in Earth's geomagnetic flux, picked up a rare inversion wave, something only observed during extreme solar storms. But there had been no solar activity. The timing of the wave matched the moment. GNZ1's leading edge intersected with a band of deep Earth magnetic sensors in that region. For those watching carefully, the conclusion became inescapable. This wasn't a natural interaction. The zone didn't behave like a gravitational ripple from a rogue mass. It behaved like a corridor, like a gate was being stabilized in real time, a region carved out of natural physics to make room for something that couldn't exist under normal conditions. And just like the shadow ring, the gravity null zone was moving faster than the structure that seemed to create it, meaning Earth wasn't just approaching the object, it was entering its environment. The Earth's core has always been a mystery wrapped in certainty. We know it exists, we know it spins, and we know that spin is responsible for the magnetic field that shields us from the sun's radiation. What we didn't know, what we never expected, was that something outside the Earth could tamper with the rhythm of the inner planet. Just hours after the leading edge of the gravity null zone grazed the upper reaches of Earth's magnetic shell, seismologists began seeing something strange, not above us, but deep below. Across multiple observatories, a subtle drift appeared in seismic echo patterns. These are the measured shockwaves from natural events, tiny tremors, man-made activity, or even large ocean waves. Normally, these waves pass through Earth's mantle and core with reliable timing. But now, certain wavefronts were lagging. Others were speeding up, and they weren't bouncing off the mantle as expected. They were bending inward, toward the center. It was as if the Earth's core had started vibrating slightly out of tune. In Japan, a high-sensitivity lab noticed the first clear sign. A network of deep-pressure sensors recorded a brief, but undeniable dip in expected spin rate of the inner core. For 23 minutes, the spin slowed just enough to cause a measurable delay in angular momentum. It corrected itself minutes later, but the event was recorded, and it was not localized. Similar slowdowns were then observed in Chile, Iceland, and along the mid-Atlantic ridge. These weren't isolated tremors or geological noise. This was systemic. And then came the magnetosphere pulses. Low Earth orbit satellites began logging flickering behavior in their magnetic shielding. Normally, Earth's magnetosphere deflects most charged particles from space, but something caused minor but sudden surges in particle density near the equator. It was like the field was being rhythmically tugged, contracted and released by something beneath the crust. It wasn't until these surges were mapped in time and space that researchers realized what they were looking at. The pulses were spiraling. From the core outward, electromagnetic waveforms were radiating in a spiral motion, like the planet was sending out distress signals. Not uniformly, not from the poles, but from multiple points just under, the equator, matching where the null zone passed. No natural model could simulate this. The only working hypothesis? The gravitational suppression wave wasn't just affecting satellites or oceans. It was whispering to the molten iron in Earth's outer core, interrupting its spin ever so slightly. And in doing so, it was disturbing the electromagnetic equilibrium Earth had maintained for over 4 billion years. If that equilibrium fractures, the consequences are no longer abstract. Every magnetic compass could lose orientation. Every migrating animal that depends on geomagnetic cues could falter. And worse, if Earth's magnetic shield were to weaken significantly, even temporarily, the planet could become vulnerable to solar radiation in ways no civilization has ever experienced. But here's what makes it even more unsettling. The spin disruption followed a pattern eerily close to that seen near neutron stars, collapsed cores of massive stars that sometimes glitch, causing sudden changes in their rotation due to unknown internal stress. Except Earth is not a neutron star. It is a living, moving planet with fluid layers, ecosystems, and tectonic breath. A planet not meant to flicker, pause, or hesitate. And yet, on the morning of December 17th, it did. Not because of anything it did, but because something outside of it, something 40 times larger than the comet that already bent the rules of physics, had arrived. This wasn't a magnetic storm. This was a calibration event. Something was testing Earth's response to internal interference, measuring how much gravitational and electromagnetic stress the planet could tolerate before failing to protect itself. And as the pulses grew more defined, one question rippled through every observatory on Earth. Was the core simply reacting, or was it being prepared? The tremors in Earth's core hadn't even settled when another anomaly emerged, one that didn't come from below, but from the sky. And yet, somehow, the two events seemed to mirror each other like opposite sides of a cosmic equation. This time, it wasn't the rotational magnetic flow that changed, it was the sound, or rather, the echo of something much bigger than sound. Observatories in Antarctica, equipped with ultra-low frequency sensors designed to monitor atmospheric disturbances, detected a set of faint but rhythmic pulses. These weren't seismic, they weren't sonic, they were electromagnetic echoes, waves that bounced between Earth's atmosphere and ionosphere in a pattern that had never been recorded before. Even stranger, they didn't come from one direction. They came from everywhere. The reflective pattern spanned hemispheres. From the Polar Research Station at Vostok to a high-altitude lab in the Andes, the same pulse frequency emerged. 5 long tones, separated by silence, followed by one short burst. A few seconds later, the sequence repeated. Over and over again, the rhythm didn't match any known natural event. Not solar flares, not lightning activity, not auroras. It wasn't even consistent with Schumann resonances, the Earth's natural electromagnetic background hum. This was something new, something intentional, something that responded to movement. Because every time a major shift happened in Earth's crust, like the spin disruption in the core or the tide shifts in the null zone, the echo changed slightly. A pitch increase, a new waveform, a subtle doubling of a harmonic. It was like a sonar system had activated around the planet, mapping its pulse, listening to its breath. And just as researchers started recording these reflections, something even more bizarre occurred. Some of the signals returned. A delayed pulse, an echo of the echo, came back stronger, louder, sharper, as if something in space had heard it, bounced it back and amplified it. Astronomers called it a double-back event, the first in recorded history. Imagine dropping a pebble into a still pond. Ripples spread outward, but instead of fading, some of them reverse and come back, larger than before, as if the edge of the pond had sent them back with more energy than they started with. But space doesn't do that. It absorbs, it spreads, it dampens. Unless, of course, something is out there, not absorbing, but reflecting. That idea shook everyone who reviewed the data, because the only known materials capable of creating such a reflective feedback loop were not natural. They were manufactured, like metallic foils, advanced satellites, artificial plasma mirrors, or dense layered structures not native to our solar system. When teams mapped the timing and origin of these returning signals, they converged toward one direction, the same arc along which the black structure was travelling. The object that was 40 times larger than 3I Atlas. The object that had no cometary tail, no outgassing, no erosion, just motion. And now it was not just heading toward Earth, it was communicating with it. Not in language, not in words, but through resonance. Every pulse, every reflected beat, every reversal of signal, it all formed a pattern. One scientist at the European Space Agency put it this way: "It's not that we're being scanned, it's that we're being measured, like we're inside a chamber designed to understand how sound bounces in flesh, stone, liquid, and iron." The echoes weren't just probing the atmosphere, they were mapping what lies beneath it. The full structure of Earth, its crust, mantle, oceans, cities, energy grids, even seismic pressure zones, was being illuminated from above with invisible pulses, and something was watching the way those echoes bent, broke, and returned. This wasn't a beacon, it was a test, not of communication, but of resonance compatibility. Something wanted to know how Earth responded to frequency, how it reflected information, how it adapted to input. Because in the language of advanced civilizations, before words, before contact, comes one fundamental question: can you resonate with us? And by December 17th, the answer had already been recorded. For weeks, the structure had remained visually static, unmoving in shape, lacking any rotation, offering no signs of propulsion. But on the morning of December the 17th, something changed, not in how it looked, but in what it did to the space around it. It began with a sharp distortion noticed by a spectrometry array aboard a private satellite network. Operators monitoring background radiation levels around the object observed an irregular surge, like a sudden vacuum had been created around the black mass. Photons behaved strangely in its vicinity. Light didn't bend, it scattered, and not like it would around a planet, asteroid, or comet. The scattering didn't follow Newtonian paths, it followed something unfamiliar. At first, analysts assumed this was a sensor malfunction, but then another station, this one on a geosynchronous weather satellite, picked up the same anomaly. It wasn't light that had changed. It was the field around the object. A high-density gravitational sheath? A temporary ion barrier? None of the known explanations fit, because this field didn't interact with solar wind like a magnetosphere would. It didn't deflect radiation. It absorbed it, and then released it later, in pulses that didn't match any predictable decay sequence. The readings were erratic, but one truth emerged clearly. This structure was producing a field not native to Earth, and not typical of natural interstellar objects. The data came in layers. First, there was the null zone effect, radio silence around the object. Then came the thermal void. No heat signature, no infrared feedback. But now a third layer had appeared. A wave suppression zone. It was as if the very laws of wave propagation, sound, light, magnetism, were being rewritten within a narrow perimeter around the mass. This was no longer about mass, motion, or trajectory. It was about influence. The object wasn't just approaching Earth's orbit. It was bending the environment ahead of it, quietly shaping the space it intended to enter. And what disturbed physicists most was that the shape of the field, it wasn't random, it was geometric. Through resonance mapping and backscatter reconstruction, a hexagonal pattern began to emerge from the way particles curved around the field. It pulsed like a web, tight in the center, expanding outward, then collapsing and restarting. One theorist from the University of Tokyo described it as a dynamic lattice, a living grid that rearranges spacetime locally to create stable atmospheric pressure without needing a ship hull. Others compared it to known experiments with metamaterials, substances designed to bend energy around objects, making them temporarily invisible. Except this wasn't an experiment. This was functional, and the scale of it, hundreds of kilometers wide, possibly larger than Earth's entire magnetosphere in localized influence. But somehow, it didn't trigger alarms. No EMPs, no satellite shutdowns, no physical damage, just silence. Measured, deliberate, intelligent silence. And then the birds responded. In areas beneath the path of the object's projected trajectory, Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, migratory flocks changed course, not by instinct, not by weather, but as if their internal magnetic maps had been scrambled. They avoided the invisible corridor forming in the sky. The same thing happened with whales off the Norwegian coast. They surfaced early, circled each other, then dove deeper than usual and didn't return for hours. Submarine crews noted it. Fishing trackers confirmed it. Even migratory insects vanished from air radar. Nature was responding to the field, the way animals react before an earthquake, except this wasn't geological. It was atmospheric, magnetic, gravitational, and entirely unfamiliar. One biologist summarized it like this: something is creating a zone above us where the rules no longer apply, and every living creature with a sense for natural order is getting out of its way. It didn't feel like an invasion. There were no weapons, no pressure waves, no warnings. But it felt deliberate. The object wasn't moving blindly. It was carving space in advance of its arrival, preparing a corridor, or worse, a portal, and Earth was already inside its influence. While most eyes were fixated on the skies, watching the silent glide of the black structure through upper orbital space, a different kind of signal was coming from below, deep beneath Earth's oceans, and for those listening, it didn't just whisper, it pressed. On the morning of December 17th, hydroacoustic stations located throughout the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans began transmitting irregular pressure waves. These weren't earthquakes. Seismographs stayed still. But the ocean floor sensors detected something else entirely. Long, undulating pulses that mimicked the characteristics of a seismic event, but came with no tectonic origin. The readings resembled what would be expected if an object had triggered an ultra-low frequency pressure bubble from above, like gravity was leaking downward through the ocean's column in concentric pulses. Oceanographers described it as a slow, methodical breathing of the sea. The tides weren't rising, the oceans weren't warming, but something underneath was moving, or more accurately responding. Military submarines reported subtle shifts in buoyancy control. Depth sensors needed recalibration. The deeper they travelled, the more apparent it became. The ocean itself had become less predictable. Certain areas in the Mariana Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, and even under the Arctic shelf recorded brief periods where salt density and pressure gradients no longer aligned with established oceanographic models. For a few hours, it was as if the water no longer obeyed gravity in those zones. Buoyancy levels changed. Instruments floated where they shouldn't have. Drones drifted without propulsion. One ROV in the Indian Ocean registered a temporary collapse of feedback signal. It didn't go offline, it just couldn't communicate through the medium anymore. Something in the water, whether in composition, magnetism, or structure, had shifted, and the only known variable that could account for that shift was now orbiting above Earth, casting no shadow, making no noise, yet subtly tuning the ocean from above. Marine biologists began noting behavioral changes too. Certain deep-sea species, typically constrained to abyssal plains and unlit crevices, were appearing in mid-depth ranges, far from their usual habitats. The colossal squid, rarely encountered and notoriously elusive, was caught on sonar over 1,000 meters above its usual zone. It wasn't fleeing, it was rising. Something beneath the sea, something ancient perhaps, was being disturbed. What baffled scientists the most was a distinct resonance that began to show up across all hydrophones. A rhythmic tremor repeating every 7 minutes, exact and unwavering. Not seismic, not mechanical, but almost engineered. The tremor's signal seemed to originate simultaneously across thousands of kilometers of ocean floor, forming a patterned echo, like sonar being returned from somewhere deeper than we've ever explored. And then came the pressure anomalies. In specific trenches, undersea pressure sensors recorded transient collapses, brief moments where the crushing tons of seawater pressing downward simply lessened for just a few seconds. It was as if something vast, something distributed across a wide oceanic region, had temporarily lifted the weight of the sea, then returned it, without a splash, without a tremor. One geophysicist described it as the ocean's exhaling in reverse. Even stranger was the atmospheric echo that followed. Weather stations near coastal fault zones detected barometric drops unlinked to any storms. One NOAA technician remarked, "It's like the oceans pulled air down into them, as if the surface was no longer the boundary." This led to a chilling hypothesis, that the object above was not just exerting influence downward, but drawing something up. If the black structure's field was altering space, could it also be syncing with something buried beneath Earth's oceans? Something dormant, now stirring? Several researchers proposed the idea of a resonance lock, an alignment between orbital and sub-crust frequencies. If that was true, then the structure wasn't just passing by, it was activating something. From below, something waiting in the deep. As the black structure remained in low orbital drift, a new pattern began to emerge, not from Earth's surface, but from above. On the morning of December 17th, radio telescopes in Chile, South Africa, and Hawaii began to receive anomalous echo reflections from the direction of the moon. These weren't cosmic rays, they weren't solar rebounds. These were direct frequency rebounds, a tight, repeating pulse that bounced off the lunar surface at an angle that made no sense, not unless the moon was hollow. It wasn't a new theory. The idea that Earth's moon might be more than just a solid rock dates back decades. In 1969, when Apollo 12 deliberately crashed the ascent stage of its lunar module onto the moon's surface, the seismic sensors left behind recorded the surface ringing like a bell. At the time, it was explained as shallow crust resonance. But in light of today's data, that explanation no longer holds. Because now, under the influence of the structure, the moon is responding again. But this time, it's not ringing. It's resonating. Lunar seismographs from both NASA and private observatories picked up harmonic pulses coming from deep beneath the moon's crust. pulses that matched almost perfectly the same 7-minute intervals being recorded in Earth's oceans. That meant one thing: the black structure orbiting above Earth was emitting or synchronizing a signal that not only affected the Earth's internal systems but the Moon's interior as well. This prompted a stunning question. What if the Moon isn't just responding? What if it's part of the system? Immediately, a team of researchers began correlating orbital positions, tidal forces, and gravitational flux between the black structure, the Earth, and the Moon. What they found was nothing short of disturbing. Every time the black structure passed over a certain sector of Earth, the Moon's internal signal shifted in phase, like a tuning fork falling into resonance. The Moon's gravity didn't change, its surface didn't quake, but its inner signal did. Some referred back to the ancient hollow moon theories, suggesting the Moon could be a shell wrapped around a long-dormant machine. Others rejected the idea outright, instead proposing that the Moon was being used like a lens, or a relay, by the black structure. And then came the visual confirmation. High-resolution thermal imaging from Japan's Kagaya orbiter detected faint but increasing heat signatures at specific coordinates along the Moon's Tycho crater, particularly near the central peak. There was no known reason for this area to warm. There was no sunlight hitting it at the time of scan. Yet the readings showed a narrow line, less than 5 kilometers across, gaining heat over several hours. It was as if something beneath the crater had begun to stir, and for some scientists that was the confirmation they'd been waiting for. The black structure, it seemed, had not just come to influence Earth, it had reactivated the Moon. This shifted the entire framework of planetary defense. If the Moon was now playing a role in the structure's geometry, it meant Earth was caught in a multi-body system, an engineered array of gravitational, electromagnetic, and potentially intentional synchronization. Earth wasn't just a target, it was a node. Across radio astronomy communities, old fringe theories were now being re-examined under new light. Was the Moon ever just a captured object? Or was it placed with purpose, a perfect size, a perfect orbit, a perfect mirror to Earth's rhythms, waiting for the signal that would awaken it? And on this day, December 17th, that signal may have arrived. Because for the first time in recorded history, the Moon was not just reflecting light, it was reflecting behavior. When orbital physicists examined the trajectory of the black structure again on the morning of December the 17th, they found something deeply unsettling. The object was no longer following a consistent elliptical arc. It had shifted, twice, over the course of 24 hours, defying both gravitational expectations and Newtonian physics. Its path was bending in ways that implied not just propulsion, but intention. Initially, its orbit seemed to loosely track the Earth's equator, a common pattern for geosynchronous satellites or observation platforms. But by midday, it had altered its path toward a polar inclination, as if it wanted to sweep across the entire planet in a north-south scan. Then, by evening, it adjusted again, not with a slow arc, but with a precision vector snap that bypassed known momentum constraints. It was moving like a craft, a controlled system, yet it left no visible signs of thrust, no heat trail, no ion dispersal, no propulsion signature of any kind. Astrophysicists and orbital engineers scrambled to model the math, but the variables refused to cooperate. Every adjustment made to simulate the structure's trajectory required a variable that couldn't exist under Earth's laws: reverse inertia, momentum nullification, and worst of all, orbital folding. That last term wasn't even supposed to be real. Orbital folding was something out of speculative astrophysics, a concept where space-time curvature could theoretically allow an object to jump from one point in orbit to another without crossing the space in between. It required manipulation of gravity on scales humanity couldn't produce. And yet, the data from 3 ground-based observatories confirmed it. At 03:14 GMT, the black structure vanished from one predicted path and reappeared 12 degrees west and 300 kilometers higher, instantly. The only plausible explanation was that the object was not bound by orbital mechanics as we know them. It was behaving more like a quantum-locked observer, moving where it needed to, not where gravity allowed. That's when researchers began to reframe the question. Not how was it moving, but why? And the answer, according to the pattern, was chilling. Each orbit adjustment brought the black structure closer to one of 3 points: the geomagnetic poles, the Moon, and a geostationary, triangulation point sitting directly above the equator. When plotted on a 3D map, these 3 points formed a perfect isosceles triangle, a shape that shouldn't hold in orbital physics without constant propulsion. But the structure wasn't just holding it was activating it. Each triangle leg matched a phase pulse previously seen in the Moon's seismic harmonics and in Earth's Schumann resonance field. These weren't just geometric coincidences, they were synchronized vectors of interaction. The structure was forming a field, not just around Earth, but through it. One physicist described it as an artificial ley line system in orbit, while others called it a resonance cage. Regardless of the label, the conclusion was the same. The black structure was deliberately orchestrating a geometry that locked both Earth and the Moon into an energetic lattice. But why? Some theorized it was a scanning array, designed to detect or stimulate a planetary response. Others saw it as a containment net, a kind of energetic perimeter. A few, the most daring, proposed it was a gateway, drawing specific spatial points into harmonic convergence for something else to arrive. But no one could explain how it was maintaining these impossible orbits without burning fuel, without generating heat, and without disrupting nearby satellites. Whatever the black structure was doing, it was doing it with complete control over spatial physics, and more than that, it was doing it in silence, because even now, with telescopes locked and supercomputers crunching, the structure gave off no communication, no beacons, no signals, just motion, purposeful, unreadable motion. And as the orbit locked into its third geometric node, Earth found itself suspended within an invisible triangulated field. Whatever this geometry was for, Earth was at its center. At exactly 4:02 GMT, just as the black structure completed its third orbital alignment node, something unprecedented occurred across the South Atlantic anomaly, a known region of weakened magnetic field where satellites and electronics are historically vulnerable. A total blackout. Not a power outage, not a communications delay, a full spectrum blackout across every satellite, frequency and sensor that was watching that specific patch of Earth's upper atmosphere. This wasn't just a drop in signal strength. It was the erasure of data, as if the electromagnetic spectrum had been scooped out of existence across a swath of Earth nearly the size of Brazil. All L-band satellites operating above the anomaly instantly lost telemetry. Every Q-band feed from commercial satellites turned to static. Military radar grids along the Atlantic basin showed nothing but noise. Even weather satellites, including NOAA's GOES East and the European Meteosat, showed a clean hole, like a burn mark, in their infrared and visual overlays. And it wasn't a sensor failure, because sensors kept working, just not inside that zone. Outside the anomaly's reach, satellites operated normally. The boundary was surgically precise, almost like a field had been cast downward from above, a cone of interference that followed the black structure's projected orbit across that exact longitude. The blackout lasted for 13 minutes and 17 seconds, and when it ended, the data didn't return. There was no recovery, no partial echo of lost packets, no forensic trail to reconstruct. It was simply gone. Worse, ground-based observatories in South America reported strange harmonics in their magnetometers during the blackout window. The magnetic field didn't just fluctuate, it warped. It bent in patterns that suggested localized compression, almost like the magnetosphere had been squeezed inward toward the crust. Brazilian geomagnetic scientists confirmed it. Flux vectors twisted into near-perfect spirals, as though space-time itself had pulsed inward through that part of Earth's magnetic shield. And shortly after, seismic instruments detected low-frequency vibrations deep in the ocean trench below. Not earthquakes, but pressure shifts. Something had interacted with Earth. Not from below, but from above. Some experts feared it was a targeted scan. Others, a resonance test. But one group, a coalition of radio astronomers and quantum engineers, proposed a different theory. The blackout was a calibration event. The black structure had used Earth's natural magnetic weakness to synchronize its field geometry with the planet's internal oscillations. In other words, it didn't block our signals randomly. It needed that window to align its systems with Earth's heartbeat. And now that it had, the structure wasn't just orbiting anymore, it was tuned in. This theory gained traction when, just 2 hours later, gravitational wave detectors in Chile and Italy both registered microdisturbances that mirrored each other precisely, something that had never happened outside of black hole mergers. Except this wasn't a black hole. It was something inside our planetary space, inside a carefully constructed triangulated orbit, using the South Atlantic anomaly as a key. The blackout wasn't a failure of equipment. It was the first visible activation event, and as silence settled over global agencies trying to make sense of what just happened, one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. This structure wasn't operating alone. It had a plan, a pattern, and the Earth's vulnerabilities were part of its design. Whatever had taken place above the Atlantic, it was not the end. It was the opening move, just precision, just silence. But silence from something that had taken 30 hours to complete a full energy grid across Earth's surface, and had done so by manipulating orbital speed, electromagnetic fields and the planet's own geological soft spots, was not comfort. It was threat through intelligence, and as the final telemetry came in showing the object beginning to rotate, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the implications hit hard. It had what it needed, it was in position, it had locked itself in, and Earth was now part of its design. We often think of threats as events, a blast, a collision, a countdown. But what if the real danger doesn't arrive with noise? What if it arrives with symmetry? Over the last 30 hours, this black structure, 40 times the mass of 3I Atlas, did not unleash a weapon. It did not open a hatch. It did not flash with light or issue a signal to any known frequency. And that's what makes it worse. Because it acted with purpose, with patience, with knowledge of Earth's own internal rhythms. It found the faults, mapped the magnetic weaknesses, positioned itself precisely over key resonance points, and stitched itself into our planet. Without a word. We're not watching a visitor. We're watching an insertion. This wasn't a test run. It wasn't random drift. It was a blueprint, and Earth is the paper it's been printed on. Every pattern we decoded was already part of a larger sequence. Every emission, every silent lock-in, every final pulse was part of a machine, a structure not built to be seen from orbit, but to be felt from within. We don't know what it wants. We don't know what it will do next. But we do know this. It's not coming toward Earth anymore. It's already here, locked, anchored, and listening. And somewhere inside the data, somewhere beneath the silence, the pattern is still running. We just haven't figured out how to read it yet, but we will. Because now, we don't have a choice.